In the previous two lectures, we saw that one of the ways that philosophers tried to deal with the difficulties faced by Descartes was to reject his foundationalism. The result of this was the theory of coherentism. However, as we saw, coherentism faces its own specific challenges. There are two further challenges faced both by traditional foundationalist and coherentist theories that we have not yet considered. Thinking about these will help us to formulate a new type of theory, one that wasn't really anticipated until the beginning of the 20th century. One of these further challenges for both traditional theories is that they ignore how a person's beliefs are actually formed and sustained. The fancy philosophical name for this is that both are theories of propositional justification. That means that they only look at purely logical relations between a person's evidence and their beliefs. To see why this is a problem, consider the following sort of case. Suppose I'm a detective and I'm called in to solve a murder at a private estate. I gather all of the evidence, and it clearly points to Jeeves, the butler, as the killer. Furthermore, I believe that Jeeves is the killer. So far, so good. But here's the wrinkle. As a child, I had a series of unpleasant interactions with butlers, so now I have an irrational hatred of them. And it is this irrational hatred, rather than the evidence, that is causing me to believe in Jeeves' guilt. The problem, then, is that my good evidence is neither causing nor causally supporting my belief in the butler's guilt. I would believe that he is guilty even if there weren't sufficient evidence. Philosophers nowadays generally accept that in order for you to be justified in your belief, it's not enough for you to have good evidence. Rather, your belief must be based on the good evidence that you have. The fact that you have that good evidence should explain why you hold the belief. One technical term that many philosophers use to characterize this idea is to say that theories of knowledge must include a basing relation. That is, adequate theories must include an account of what it is for beliefs to be properly based on the evidence so as to count as knowledge. We'll leave aside the issue of the basing relation for a moment and turn our attention to the second of the two further problems facing both traditional foundationalism and coherentism. But don't worry, we'll see that the new theory we'll encounter today will provide solutions to both of these two new challenges. Recall that both traditional foundationalism and coherentism are usually nowadays considered fallibilist theories. That means they hold that you can know some fact even without certain evidence. That is, they say that you can know that fact even if your evidence doesn't give you an absolutely certain guarantee that it's true. This leaves these theories open to the challenge of so-called Gettier cases, named for the philosopher Edmund Gettier, who called philosophers' attention to these phenomena in a short 1963 paper for the journal Analysis, which was entitled, "Is Justified True Belief Knowledge?" It came to be one of the most cited papers of all time. Now, here's a simple version of a Gettier case that actually came from Bertrand Russell, who wrote about the phenomenon years before Gettier, but never appreciated its significance. Suppose you're rushing to a 3 o'clock meeting in an unfamiliar building. You check the time on the clock in the hallway and it reads 2:55, so you believe that you have 5 minutes to get to the meeting location. Unbeknownst to you, however, the clock has stopped working hours before. Famously, though, even a stopped clock is right twice a day, and it just so happens that this clock stopped working exactly 12 hours ago at 2:55 a.m. Here's the problem. You believe it's 2:55. It's true that it's 2:55. Your evidence for your belief is that the clock says it's 2:55, and for all you know, you have no reason to suspect that the clock isn't working. You're even basing your belief appropriately on your evidence. Most philosophers, however, agree that you don't have knowledge in this case, since it's purely an accident that your evidence points you toward the truth. Had you looked at the clock a few minutes earlier or later, it would still have read 2:55, and your belief would be mistaken. Of course, there are versions of both coherentism and traditional foundationalism that attempt to give an account of the basing relation and solve the Gettier problem. However, a new class of theories of knowledge emerged in the 20th century that offer an elegant way of achieving both of these goals at the same time. For reasons that will become clear, these are known as externalist theories. There are now many versions of externalist theories. Luckily for us, however, one of the simplest theories is both representative of the main features of externalist views and is capable of explaining many of the features of knowledge that we seek to explain. This externalist theory is known as process reliabilism, and is the specific version of externalism that we'll focus on. One of the earliest statements of process reliabilism can be found in the work of the brilliant Cambridge mathematician F.P. Ramsey, who died in 1930 at the tragically young age of 26 of complications from jaundice. Despite his brief life, Ramsey made significant contributions to mathematics, philosophy, and economics. In mathematics, a whole branch of combinatorics, Ramsey theory, is named for F.P. Ramsey. And in economics, the Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Samuelson has described Ramsey's work as great legacies for the field. Now, in philosophy, Ramsey is better known for his work in metaphysics and the philosophy of mathematics, and for his influence on Wittgenstein. However, in a short paper that he wrote in 1929, shortly before his death, Ramsey formulated what is likely one of the earliest versions of the reliability theory. In that paper, Ramsey writes, quote, "I have always said that a belief was knowledge if it was 1. True, 2. Certain, and 3. Obtained by a reliable process." With the exception of the inclusion of what Ramsey terms certainty, this account of knowledge is very similar to ones that we would encounter today. If we reformulate the account to make it compatible with fallibilism, what we're left with is this: knowledge is true belief on the basis of a reliable process. Now, if you've studied any psychology in school, this formulation might confuse you, so I want to clarify it briefly. Psychologists use the term reliability roughly to mean consistency. In psychology, a measure is reliable if, given the same inputs, it'll yield the same outputs. For psychologists, then, something could be reliable but wrong, as long as it's wrong consistently. For instance, if my watch is running well but is set 23 minutes fast, then my watch is reliable despite not being accurate. When psychologists talk about the accuracy of a measure, they use the term validity. So for a psychologist, the best measures would be those that are both reliable and valid. It's this that philosophers are aiming at with the notion of reliable process. They're the processes that reliably result in true beliefs. So let's see how the process reliabilist theory deals with the two challenges that opened this lecture. The first, you'll recall, was the challenge of explaining the basing relation, the way in knowledge true beliefs are appropriately based on the grounds that justify them. The second was the challenge of explaining how knowledge is different from Gettier cases, in which your true beliefs are based on something that only accidentally supports the truth of your belief. Let's look at each of these. In the case of the basing relation, it's obvious how the process reliabilist theory can answer the challenge. According to the process reliabilist, knowledge is true belief formed on the basis of a reliable process, a process that reliably yields true beliefs. But then the answer to the question of how to determine the basing relation is baked right into the reliabilist theory. A belief that counts as knowledge will be appropriately based on the grounds that justify it for the process reliabilist, because what it is for a belief to be justified is precisely to be caused by a process that reliably yields true beliefs. The appropriate basis is the justification. With regard to the second challenge, that of the Gettier cases, we need to consider the notion of reliable process for a moment. Note that in order to think about reliability accurately, we'll have to suppose that we're considering a process to be reliable with respect to a certain environment. This is important because processes that are reliable with respect to one environment may not be reliable with respect to a different environment. Consider, for example, a car whose engine is designed to function properly on generally well-paved roads in an industrialized nation. In a different environment, say in a desert with few roads and a great deal of sand and dust, the engine might quickly clog and become useless. The fact that the car's engine doesn't function reliably in desert environments does not mean that it isn't reliable, but rather it's only reliable in the environments for which it was designed to function. So, strictly speaking, our account of knowledge in terms of reliable processes would have to include a reference to the environment as well. We could more properly say something like, knowledge is true belief based on a process that is reliable in the sort of environment in which that belief was produced. Here's an example. Suppose you have good vision. That doesn't mean that you can be visually aware of objects in your environment when it's pitch dark. Rather, it means that in normal lighting conditions, you can take in information about your environment by sight. Now we can answer the Gettier problem. The challenge is to come up with an account of justified true belief that explains why Gettier cases, like the stopped clock, are not cases of knowledge. And the process reliabilist theory allows us to do just this. Even though we have a true belief in the clock case, we don't have knowledge. The reason for this is that the process we've used in this case, looking at a clock in the vicinity and relying on the information it conveys, is unreliable in an environment where the clock in the vicinity has stopped. For the process reliabilist, someone who believes on the basis of an unreliable process is not justified. We have a true belief, but no justification. And no justification, no knowledge. So the process reliabilist can explain why Gettier cases aren't cases of knowledge. Externalism, represented in our discussion so far by process reliabilism, therefore seems to enjoy two advantages over traditional foundationalism and coherentism. Unlike those theories, the process reliabilist has a simple answer to the challenges posed both by the basing relation and by Gettier cases. But why is the process reliabilist theory called an externalist theory? In order to see that, let's review for a moment where we are. In the previous two lectures, we looked at two ways to think of the structure of knowledge. The first, traditional foundationalism, sees knowledge as a structure with different levels, with the higher levels built on top of the more certain levels below, and the foundations composed of the most certain beliefs. The second, coherentism, sees knowledge more like an explanation, with beliefs gaining support based on whether they add to the explanation, making it more coherent, explanatorily useful, predictively powerful, or simple and elegant. Despite the fact that they are rival views, however, both foundationalism and coherentism have two key features in common. The first feature is that what counts as support for beliefs are states that are internal to the believer. I'll explain more about this in a moment, but for now it's enough to consider a few examples. In the case of coherentism, the supports for your beliefs are just other beliefs, and the way that the totality of your beliefs fits together to form a coherent whole. If I'm evaluating my belief that it's raining outside, I evaluate it on the basis of whether it coheres with other beliefs I have, like the belief that I hear the sound of water hitting my roof, or that I see the water droplets running in rivulets down my window pane, and that I feel the humidity in the air. In the case of foundationalism, the support for your beliefs would include beliefs, but also your experiences, as well as the logic-based and content-based relations that connect them. The relations of logic would characterize the ways in which beliefs might be logically or inductively supported by other beliefs, as we'll see in a subsequent lecture. For example, my belief that there is a fire somewhere on the other side of that hill on the horizon is inductively supported by my belief that I see smoke drifting up from behind that hill on the horizon. The relations of content would characterize the ways in which my experiences support my beliefs. So, for example, my belief that there's a red apple in the green bowl in front of me on the table is, according to the classical foundationalist, supported by my visual experience as if there's a red apple in the green bowl in front of me. These examples also demonstrate the second of the two features that foundationalism and coherentism have in common. As we saw, both of the theories can only conceive of the sorts of relations that provide support for beliefs in terms of logical, conceptual, or explanatory relations. This, then, is the second of the features shared by the two views. The ways that beliefs are supported are the sorts of ways that make sense upon reflection, deductive and inductive logic, conceptual connection, or coherence. I'm tempted to say it seems almost self-evident that these would be the ways in which beliefs could receive sufficient support to count as knowledge. At the very least, we can say that the methods for supporting beliefs are supposed to be intuitively obvious. This is all very abstract, but here's a way to understand it. Think of the justification that leads to knowledge as a process governed by two types of rules. The first type of rule, let's call them input rules, tells you what kinds of inputs you can introduce into the process. The second type of rule, let's call them transition rules, tells you what you can do to the inputs or to other intermediate results within the process. The output of the process, of course, will be justified beliefs. If you've ever used tax software, you've worked with something analogous. In that case, there are two kinds of inputs, one for the type of entry and the other for some number amount. The transition rules are the rules governing what effect those types of entries and number amounts have on the tax you must pay. And the output of the process is your tax owed, or hopefully a big fat refund for you. With this way of thinking, we can characterize traditional coherentism as the view of justification that involves just one type of input, beliefs, and one type of transition rule, coherence formation, however coherence theorists are able to make sense of that notion. Traditional foundationalism will have more inputs, beliefs, but also experiences of various types, and more transition rules, deductive inference, inference based on probability, and perhaps various other types of inference. So what about process reliabilism? Let's consider this quote from F.P. Ramsey. Quote, "Can we say that a memory is obtained by a reliable process? I think perhaps we can, if we mean the causal process connecting what happens with my remembering of it. We might then say, a belief obtained by a reliable process must be caused by what are not beliefs in a way or with accompaniments that can be more or less relied on to give true beliefs." Unquote. This quote suggests that Ramsey thinks that inputs may include not just the variety of inputs that the traditional foundationalist allows, but also non-mental states, like the states of the world that characterize what happens and that I later remember. The transition rules can also be broader than either coherentism or traditional foundationalism includes. They can encompass the sorts of transitions that foundationalists and coherentists describe, just as long as those transitions are in fact reliable processes in the environments where they're deployed, but they can also include additional reliable processes not countenanced by the coherentist or foundationalist. We're finally in a position to characterize why process reliabilism is an externalist view, and why the traditional views of foundationalism and coherentism can be termed internalist views. The input rules involved in both coherentism and foundationalism limit the inputs to justification to states that are internal to your mind, either beliefs alone or beliefs and other types of mental states like experiences. And the transition rules that coherentism and foundationalism allow are supposed to be the sorts of rules that you can recognize simply through reflection to be the sorts of rules that promote the discovery of truth. In contrast, the input rules in process reliabilism allow for states of your brain and nervous system, other states of your body, or even states of the world outside of your body, potentially to serve as inputs to the processes that result in justified beliefs. And as for the transition rules, Process reliabilism allows for the possibility that there might be reliable processes leading to the formation of justified beliefs that we cannot know in advance through reflection alone. That is, for the process reliabilist, empirical research into the processes that humans or other non-human animals use to discover true information about the world will be relevant in determining whether a certain way of forming beliefs should count as justification or not. What this means is that traditional foundationalism and coherentism are internalist because they stipulate, first, that the basis for your beliefs must be internal to your mind, and second, that the way your beliefs are justified must be something you can recognize purely on the basis of reflection as being a legitimate source of justification. And process reliabilism is externalist, both because it allows that at least part of the basis of your beliefs may include states outside of your mind, and because it allows for the possibility that you might not be able to recognize, on the basis of pure reflection alone, why the actual basis for your beliefs is in fact a legitimate source of justification. Okay, that was all still a bit abstract. Let's return to a concrete case. Consider again the person who sees the clock read 2:55 and forms the belief that she has 5 minutes to get to her 3 o'clock meeting. Remember, the clock has in fact stopped, though the person doesn't know that it's stopped. According to both the foundationalist and the coherentist, the person in that case is justified. According to the process reliabilist, she is not. The advantage for the process reliabilist, as we saw already, is that they have a very simple explanation for why the Gettier case is not a case of knowledge. Although the person looking at the stopped clock has a true belief in the case where the clock happens to be right, she doesn't know because she's not justified. The foundationalist and coherentist must give a more complicated explanation for why Gettier cases don't amount to knowledge. They've offered various explanations, all of which involve adding conditions to the analysis of knowledge. Rather than saying that knowledge is justified true belief, for example, and then explaining that justification is understood in terms of either foundationalism or coherentism, they must add an additional condition that explicitly rules out Gettier cases. There have been scores of such suggestions offered. To give you a taste, the foundationalist or coherentist might suggest that the additional condition must stipulate that a belief cannot essentially be based on a false piece of evidence. In the clock case, they'd say, the person believes that it's 2:55, in part because they tacitly believe that the clock is functioning properly. Since that false piece of evidence is essential to their belief, the foundationalist or coherentist might say, this is what makes the Gettier case not an instance of knowledge, despite the fact that the person reading the clock has a justified true belief. More complicated, right? You'd think that this would be an argument in favor of process reliabilism, and I personally would be inclined to agree with you. Many philosophers, however, find it problematic that the process reliabilist says the person who sees the clock read 2:55 and forms the belief that she has 5 minutes to make her 3 o'clock meeting is unjustified. It's not her fault, they might say, that the clock isn't working. There's no reason for her to think that a clock in a busy corridor in an office building would be stopped in the middle of a workday afternoon. For this reason, then, it would seem that she is entitled to believe that it's 2:55 on the basis of seeing that the hands of the clock point to 2:55. And if she's entitled to believe it, then she must be justified in believing it. I have to admit that I just don't find this result a compelling problem for the process reliabilist. It seems to me that we can distinguish between blameless belief on the one hand and justified belief on the other. We can say that the person who, through no fault of her own, is fooled by the stopped clock is not blameworthy for believing on the basis of what the clock says, but nevertheless, she isn't justified in that belief. Since Gettier cases might still feel too abstract for you, let's look at an even more practical application of externalist ideas. There are a number of mission-critical activities in which it is important to perform a sequence of tasks in a certain order, and to make sure not to leave any of the essential tasks out of the sequence. For example, piloting a jet aircraft, particularly during takeoff or landing, or performing certain activities during surgery. On an internalist picture, it would seem that all it would take for a pilot or a surgeon to be justified in believing she was performing the task correctly would be evidence internal to her own mind. Furthermore, it doesn't seem intuitively plausible that something as simple as a checklist and team-based reminders could help to improve the outcomes of tasks performed by people as highly trained and experienced as jet pilots or surgeons. However, recent evidence suggests that implementing checklists and other team-based reminders of task sequence can result in dramatic improvements in outcomes, even in such highly skilled activities. For example, consider the case of placing a central line, a catheter placed in a large vein in the neck, chest, or groin during medical treatment. Many patients in an intensive care unit require central line placement. Such lines often remain in place for weeks or months. Both when placing the line and when checking the catheter or changing a dressing, there is a high risk of a very serious infection caused by contamination of the line due to bacteria or viruses. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, bloodstream infections associated with central line placement or maintenance, quote, result in thousands of deaths each year and billions of dollars in added cost to the U.S. healthcare system. The Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services reports that, quote, more than 1,000 intensive care units across the country reduced central line-associated bloodstream infection rates by 41% when their clinical teams implemented changes including adopting checklists and empowering other team members, like nurses, to be involved in the task sequence. It seems to me that the process reliabilist has a better explanation of why such external, team-based interventions should be so effective. On the externalist picture, such interventions actually result in more justified beliefs on the part of the practitioners, justified beliefs that they didn't have without the use of the checklist and team-based approach. Furthermore, the externalist can allow that it was only through empirical investigation that we were able to learn that these practitioners were unjustified in their beliefs prior to the implementation of the checklist and team-based approach. Even if there was no intuitive reason for thinking that a checklist and team-based approach to placing a central line could make such a difference in health outcomes, the results demonstrate that such changes can indeed result in dramatic improvements. What this discussion suggests to me is that there are good reasons to prefer an externalist picture of justification. But I don't expect that I've convinced you just yet. Luckily, we will have plenty of opportunities to explore these questions further. We've now been introduced to two different ways of thinking about theories of knowledge. We can think about them in terms of the opposition between foundationalism and coherentism, or in terms of the opposition between internalism and externalism. In the next set of lectures, we'll examine different potential sources of knowledge, sources like our awareness of our own mental states, or our sensory experiences, or our memory. We'll discuss different puzzles that each of those sources raise concerning the nature of knowledge, and we'll examine what sorts of evidence they provide in order to help us determine whether foundationalism, coherentism, or externalism best explains the structure of knowledge.